Non-dual teachers brainwashing their students, Neo-advaita teachers brainwashing their students. The reason why I'm asking this question, why I even thought about it, is because I was watching a YouTube video on a channel called the Buddha at the Gas Pump, where a man named Rick Archer is interviewing many different spiritual people, and he was interviewing a woman called Jessica Eve, who has a background of being into the Neo-advaita scene, and she felt it took her into a downward spiral. She has climbed out of that downward spiral and is seeking to help other people, because she's realizing that there are many people who have had severe effects of this whole Neo-advaita non-duality phenomenon. And so during the interview, there was a person who asked a question that basically, how do you explain that so many of these non-dual teachers, Neo-advaita teachers, they all have the same experience of non-self and that nothing is real? And what Rick was saying is that part of it is that the Neo-advaita teachers are reinforcing each other because they all believe in the same story, namely non-self and nothing is real. And then Jessica was saying that the goal of Neo-advaita and non-duality is to give people a certain experience, which is what I would in neutral terms call a mystical experience. But before you have the experience, you are being told what to conclude from the experience, how to interpret the experience. And therefore, she was raising the question, which I think is the essential question here, if she had been told, or if she hadn't been told that this experience means that there is no self and that nothing is real and therefore nothing ultimately matters, would she necessarily have made that conclusion, that there is no self, nothing is real, and so forth? In other words, if he had ahead of time been given a different interpretation, would she have reached a different conclusion? Perhaps even, is it necessary to have an interpretation, or can we just say that the experience shows us there is a spaciousness beyond our own minds? And I think this is a very important topic, not just for Neo-advaita or non-duality, but for all spiritual teachings. And so to just get started on the topic, let's talk about the difference between religion and mysticism. So religion is a set of beliefs, a set of doctrines, a very specific structure. And religion tells you to believe in what the leaders of the religion are saying. It may not be the one who started it, like Jesus or the Buddha or whatever, but the current priesthood that are, what do you want to call it, managing the religion, their interpretation, their doctrines, this is what you have to believe because they're experts and you're not. So in contrast to this, we have mysticism, and there has always been mysticism. Even before Neo-advaita non-duality, even before Advaita Vedanta, there was always mysticism. Because mysticism is based on direct experience. Let's not even talk about what you are experiencing when you have a mystical experience, but it's based on experience. And so, in its essence, mysticism is experiential. However, it can't just be experiential. And here's the reason for that. Actually, before I go into that, let me just finish my thought on the difference between religion and mysticism. Because you have people in every religious tradition who have had mystical experiences and who have taken a more mystical approach to life. But the question is, what do you do with your mystical experience? How do you interpret it? And you have some people, for example, who have grown up in a Christian culture and they have mystical experiences, and now they call themselves Christian mystics. And I can understand it, I'm not trying to put it down, but I'm just saying can you really confine mysticism to a particular religion? Can there be Christian mystics, Sufi mystics, Hindu mystics, Buddhist mystics? Is that really the highest understanding of it? Or can we instead say that mysticism is something universal, because you find mystics in every religion. You find mystics who don't belong to any formal religion, but have perhaps even created their own view. So I would say mysticism transcends all labels we can put on it. And therefore you can't even say they are Advaita Vedantic mystics or Neo-advaita mystics or non-dual mystics. Because to me, the mystical experience is universal, it's beyond words, it's beyond interpretation. And therefore, the question really is, if these Neo-advaita non-dual teachers are telling people to interpret a mystical experience a certain way, are they mystics, or are they really creating a new religion? Are they seeking to create a new religion that gains followers who believe in what these teachers are saying? So I would say, to go back to the idea of brainwashing, that formal religions are brainwashing their followers. They are telling them from a young age, this is what you're supposed to believe, and never question it. And are Neo-advaitans and non-dual teachers doing the same? Or are they seeking to help people go beyond this, where you actually do question, but you don't question it in a way that has negative consequences for you? Okay, so back to what I started to talk about. Why do we need to interpret a mystical experience? And here's why. So you have a person who has grown up in a normal society, let's say a Western democracy. You have maybe being exposed to Christianity, you have certainly been exposed to scientific materialism, evolution, we are evolved apes, and your consciousness is a product of the brain. And so you have grown up having a certain experience that's probably very similar to what your parents have, what your family has, with people in school, and so forth. One day, whatever age, you suddenly have a mystical experience. You have an experience that is outside your normal state of awareness. Our mystical experiences can take somewhat different shapes, that can have different intensity, but many people have had a mystical experience that was radically different from their normal state of awareness. And this can be very, very confusing, disorienting. It can even cause an identity crisis, where the mystical experience is so real that you begin to doubt whether your normal experience is real, whether what you experience during your normal state of awareness, whether that's real or not. And it suddenly becomes difficult to bridge the gap between the two. And this is what can cause people to really feel confused and disoriented. So what I'm saying here is, mysticism is experiential, but if it is only experiential, it becomes very confusing and difficult to deal with. So this means that when you have mystical experiences, you need to put them in some kind of context. You need to explain them in some way. You need to interpret them in some way. And so this means that if you look at it historically, as I said, many people have had mystical experiences, and they have attempted to deal with them in various ways. So there are many different ways to interpret mystical experiences, some within the context of formal religions, some outside formal religions, some purely mystical. And so the question now is, what effect does the interpretation have on people's ability to live, to function, or how they feel, how they suddenly experience life? And Jesus made a comment 2,000 years ago about false teachers, that on their fruits ye shall know them. So therefore it is always relevant to look at, here you have, for example, a group of spiritual teachers like Neo-advaita. what are their fruits? What does it do for people to follow these teachers? What is the effect on people's lives? And and so you can look at this, and obviously some people are beginning to see that they have experienced negative effects of following this. But on the other hand, you can find that in many other spiritual movements, or formal religions, or so forth, that some people have negative effects of it. So I'm not trying to, I'm not really trying to put down Neo-advaita or non-duality. I'm just trying to say it is necessary to consider what are the effects of how we interpret the raw experience. And that's why I wanted to focus on this idea that there is no self and that nothing is real. Now, I have, as I've said many times, ever since I was a child, probably at 3 or 4 years old, I've had mystical experiences that just happened spontaneously, in the sense that I didn't deliberately seek to bring about the experience. I've also later used various forms of meditation. I took a meditation course when I was 19 or 20, where the goal was to bring about mystical experiences through these advanced meditation techniques. And it worked for me in the sense that I had a lot of these experiences. And I came home from that course being completely disoriented, having an identity crisis, not being able to deal with everyday life, just like so many people describe as the effects of Neo-advaita. So I understand what people are going through. But what I have come to since then, this is a number of years ago, so I processed the experience a lot, is to realize that the essential understanding to come to about mystical experiences is that they are meant to give us a frame of reference that is outside our normal state of awareness, our normal experience of life. It shows us, number one, there is something outside our normal experience, and this allows us to look at our normal experience of life in a different way and ask the question. First, we can ask, is the way we have been brought up to experience life, is that the only way to experience life? And when you can theorize about this, you can have an intellectual understanding about it, but only when you have had a mystical experience do you know through experience that there is an alternative. There is another way to experience life. And then we can begin to ask, is the way we normally experience life, is that real? Is it, the elements of our experience, are they real? And that's where you can have this experience that the mystical experience, you're experiencing that it is more real than your normal experience of life. And what does this do? What is the purpose of this? Well, in my worldview, and I know this is not shared by some of these non-dual or Neo-advaita teachers, but in my worldview, we are meant to raise our level of consciousness. That is really the purpose of our life. I explained this in my video about how the world was created, where I explained that we are meant to be co-creators with the Creator. And we do this by starting with a limited sense of self and gradually expanding it. So, if you look at human beings on Earth, and if you incorporate reincarnation, which I do, then you can say most people on Earth are at a certain level of consciousness where they believe that their way of experiencing life is the only way to experience it. There is no alternative. There's nothing higher. What they see is reality. This is the way the world is. Then you see that there's a group of people who have begun to question this. I sometimes talk about a reality simulator where you can have two different experiences in the simulator: an immersion experience, where you believe the way you experience life is the only one and it's real, or an awakening experience where you're beginning to question the reality of this normal experience. So you see millions of people all over the world who are in this phase right now of awakening from the reality simulator's induced reality. They're beginning to question whether what we experience in our normal awareness is real. And this is a necessary process of spiritual growth. It's It's potentially a healthy process, but it also has certain risks and pitfalls. And the major pitfall here is that if you move too quickly in questioning the reality of your normal experience, it can become very disorienting and confusing and have actually destructive effects, because you come to a point where you can think, I have no self, therefore I don't really exist. The world is not real, therefore nothing exists, therefore nothing has a purpose. And this is the risk. So this is why we go back to the Buddha 2,500 years ago, who he first grew up in a palace, the normal way of experiencing life that most people have. Then he went out in the forest, and for 6 years he was one of the ascetics that were basically seeking to force themselves to have a mystical experience. And they were, in a sense, questioning the reality of everything. We don't have a record of exactly what the Buddha went through in those 6 years, but we can certainly assume that he had many of these non-dual mystical experiences, and that he really came to question what is real and what is unreal. And perhaps he even got to a point where he felt an identity crisis. But then the Buddha has this breakthrough, and he realizes that the ascetic approach is too extreme. So he comes up with a concept of the middle way, which is a more balanced approach. And personally, I've always been guided by this, and therefore my byword on the spiritual path has been balance. Always strive for balance. Don't seek to take heaven by force, as Jesus expressed it. So what we have now is we can see that when you are a spiritual person, when you are open to something, you are actually in the process of distancing yourself from the sense of self that most people have, where you believe the world is absolutely real and there's only one way to experience it. So you're questioning that sense of reality. And what you're really ideally doing is you're building a new sense of self and a new sense of what's real. Take care of that, what I'm saying here. You're questioning the normal state of a sense of reality, but you're building a new sense, a higher discernment of what is real and unreal. You are not, in the ideal scenario, meant to think that, oh, I don't exist, and the world doesn't exist, and nothing is real, and nothing has a purpose. Because the purpose of the ideal scenario is that you expand your sense of self, you reach a higher level of experience of the world, appreciation for the world, you become more of a creative being who is willing to bring forth something new in the world. And that is really what spiritual growth is about. And in contrast to this, if you go into that extreme, well, you are sabotaging the real purpose of spiritual growth, is that you become more aware of who you are, your potential as a spiritual being. So we could say that most people in the world have a worldly sense of identity. They are human beings, whatever that means in their society. And what we are doing on the spiritual path is we are distancing ourselves, we are gradually discarding that worldly sense of identity and coming to identify ourselves as spiritual beings, not as non-beings. That's never been the real purpose of the spiritual path. So why is it that some people have gone into this, what we can say is an unbalanced approach, that nothing is real and you don't exist? Well, I've actually explained that in one of my other non-duality videos, where I talk about how in the duality consciousness, and this is why I say again and again, you can't grasp non-duality if you don't understand duality and the duality consciousness. In the duality consciousness, there are always these two opposite polarities. So what I have also explained, including in my video about how the world was created, is that we have free will, and we have two options for exercising that free will. We can see ourselves as connected beings, meaning we experience we are connected to something outside our own minds, meaning our minds are not closed systems, our minds are not able to define reality, but we can discover what is real by connecting to that something. The other option is we can go into what I call the illusion of separation, that we are separate beings. And now our minds become closed systems. We don't have any frame of reference from outside of what's created by our personal minds, but also by the collective minds of humankind. Many times, of course, we take over beliefs that are in the collective consciousness. And so now we are trying to, so you could say, well, as long as you're connected, you are trying to reach higher and higher levels of connectedness until you reach a level of oneness, which is ultimately the oneness with your higher self, which exists in the spiritual realm. When you go into separation, you feel a sense of loss, you feel a sense of insecurity, you create the ego to deal with this, and the ego is on this impossible quest to always create some ultimate state, some ultimate experience, reach some ultimate truth. So, what happens is, when people go into the state of separation, they go into what I call the school of hard knocks. They can't contact a higher level of awareness, they can't contact any spiritual teachers, a higher level of mind. So the only option is to attempt to build this separate self and make it as sophisticated as possible, because there's this belief floating around that if the separate self becomes sophisticated enough, it'll become immortal, it'll get into heaven. So you see some people that are desperately trying to set themselves up at having more power, being more knowledgeable, like they are the ones who can define what's real and unreal. You see it in scientific materialism, you see it in philosophy, political ideologies, and religion, even mystical teachings. So, as I said, in duality, always two opposites. So the one approach in duality is you can attempt to build the separate self to an ultimate status. This is an impossible quest. So after many embodiments are trying to do this, there are people who have come to the point where they realize the futility of this quest. But now the question is, do they see why it was futile to try and build the separate self to an ultimate status? And you can only see that when you understand the duality consciousness. As I said, there's always the two polarities. And that it's the tension between the two polarities that makes it impossible. If you don't see that, you can use the duality consciousness to reason. It's the separate self that's the cause of suffering. So, if I have no self, then I won't suffer. The separate self makes me believe that this world is real and that it is important for me that I, for example, have some power or status or money in this world. So, if I doubt that anything in the world is real, then I'll be free of this suffering. And as I've explained, including in my video about the nonsense of non-self and other videos on non-duality, this is a dualistic reasoning. So in other words, there are non-dual teachers who are approaching non-duality from a dualistic perspective with a dualistic state of consciousness. They've simply flipped from the one dualistic extreme of wanting to glorify the separate self to the other dualistic extreme of wanting to not only eradicate the separate self, but all sense of self. Because they think there's only the separate self or nothing. There's only the separate self or undifferentiated awareness, whether they call it infinite awareness or Brahman or the Atman or whatever. So they are denying that there's an individual self. And as I've said, you can, this is the feature of duality that you also need to understand, is that in duality, in your own mind, you can create any experience you want. And you do this by creating this, what I call a subconscious self or a separate self. That's like a perception filter. It's like colored glasses. You're literally going inside the self. You're looking through the glasses, and what you see through the glasses seems absolutely real. So you can create this sense there is no self. The self is not real. the world is not real, nothing matters. And this is a structure you're creating in your own mind. And once you go into it, it seems absolutely real for a time. And there are people who have had this experience. I am liberated. I don't have any separate self. I don't have any self, therefore I don't suffer. But what many people have also experienced is after a while the suffering comes back. And as I've explained, that's because you haven't resolved these subconscious selves that cause you to suffer. But the point I'm getting at is that the feature of the duality consciousness is that it can give you experiences as a separate self. But those experiences are created in the mind, not necessarily in your personal mind, also in the collective mind. So the purpose of a mystical experience is to give you direct experience that there's something outside of this structure you have created in your mind. We all have a structure in the mind. But when you have a mystical experience, you experience there's something outside. The question is, when you come back from a mystical experience, because a mystical experience isn't permanent, it's certainly for most people you switch in and out of it. Sometimes it can last longer, but most people eventually go out of it. So how do you then deal with a mystical experience? And the quintessential question here is, do you realize what duality is? Do you realize that your normal experience is created in your mind? And do you therefore say, now that I've experienced that there's something outside of my mind that is real, that is more real than what is in my mind, now I can begin to question the structures I have in my mind. That's what I'm saying with the subconscious self. You begin to question the self, the illusion, the problem it presents that you have to solve, and the illusion behind that. And once you see the illusion, you can let the self die. You're letting a specific self die. You're not letting all sense of self die. You're not letting your identity die. So then you let a specific self die, you are more free. But then there's another self on the next level up on the spiral staircase, and you again need to let that die and then go higher. So what I'm saying is, there is no all or nothing, one glorious ego death, awakening, enlightening experience. It happens in stages. And this is the purpose, is that it happens in stages, because as I explained in several videos, there is a purpose to us even going into duality, but certainly going into the world. So what I'm saying is this. The interpretation from non-dual teachers that there is no self and that nothing is real and there's no meaning to anything is not the full understanding. It's true that the separate self, what you can call the ego, which I see as a conglomerate of these lesser selves, that separate self is not real. It's created in the mind. But it isn't necessarily a negative. It's created to give us a certain experience. So the question is, have we had enough of that experience? And then when we have, we need to see what was it that gave us that experience and dismiss that illusion. So that separate self is not real. It's true. You can actually come to a state where you don't have a separate self. But that doesn't mean you don't have a self. If you are thinking, and if you are convinced that you have no self, you have attained a state of no self, that's an experience created in your mind. It's not a mystical experience of stepping outside the mind. If you have convinced yourself that the world isn't real, the world really isn't there, the world is just created in your mind, it's just a dream, that's an experience you're having in your mind. That's not a mystical experience of stepping outside the mind. If you have convinced yourself that life has no purpose, that the purpose of existence is to attain non-existence, that's an experience you created in your mind. And what has happened here is that you may have had some genuine mystical experiences of stepping outside the mind. But when you got out of the experience again, or went back into your normal state of mind, you are now using your worldview, your belief system, to superimpose upon the experience. So listen very carefully here. The purpose of a mystical experience is to help us question the reality of our normal state of mind, including our beliefs, including our spiritual beliefs, including, for example, the belief in non-self. But misusing a mystical experience is when we take the mystical experience and we use it to validate the structures in the mind. The purpose of mystical experience is itself to gradually free ourselves from all the structures in the mind. But we can, if we don't grasp this, misuse an experience and interpret it in such a way that it seems to validate the structures in our mind. If you don't grasp this, you can make yourself believe that you are ego-free and you have experienced ego death, but you haven't. You've actually become more trapped in the ego than most people are, because, as I said before, nobody is more trapped in a prison than the person who believes he has escaped the prison. So you're not looking for the subtle aspects of the ego. Because, as I said, the ego always wants to make you believe that you have found some ultimate truth, that you have some ultimate experience. And there are people who believe that experiencing no self is the ultimate experience you can experience. But as I have said, what's experiencing? What is it? What is the self that's saying there is no self? There's always an experiencer who is experiencing life. So you could say that the goal of the spiritual path is to shed all the outer elements, the dualistic selves, the separate selves, until you stand naked as the original self that descended from the spiritual realm, that was sent as an extension of your spiritual self. This is why Jesus, 2,000 years ago, he said to Nicodemus that only the being who descended from heaven can ascend back to heaven. And the way I explain this in my video about how the world was created and other videos is that the core of our being is the conscious you, which is pure awareness or neutral awareness. In other words, in our outer minds, we have all these structures, feelings, thoughts, sense of identity, what I call the selves, and that's what most people identify with. They think this is who I am. So the spiritual path is disidentifying itself from all of this, the worldly sense of identity, realizing this is not who I am. I am not that. But then you can come to experience what many mystics throughout the ages have experienced, pure awareness. And in pure awareness, when you first experience it, see, this is another thing that's very important to grasp. Mystical experiences have stages. And in the beginning, there will be a very big contrast between your normal state of awareness and the mystical experience. So that's why when what I call the conscious you, which is the conscious you is normally pulled into the outer selves, the outer structures, and experiences itself as that outer structure. When you have a mystical experience, the conscious you goes outside of it. Now it is experiencing itself as pure awareness, as neutral awareness. I'm not all of this outer things. It can take different forms for different people, but it's essentially you're experiencing that you are not the way you normally see yourself. So when you experience yourself as pure awareness, it can seem like there is no self there. Because compared to your normal sense of self, this feels like there's no self. And it can also feel like your normal way of looking at the world is not real. But when you have more mystical experiences, you get more used to it. The contrast becomes less important. You're not so focused on the contrast between normal and mystical. And you can begin to explore the mystical experience more deeply. And that's when you realize that even when you are experiencing pure awareness, there's still an experiencer I've given this analogy before. You're driving in your car. You're driving into a forest on a bumpy gravel road. It's very noisy. Then you come to a parking lot, you stop your car, turn off the engine. And in the beginning it seems like, oh, it's so quiet. But then as you sit there, you begin to realize, oh, there's a bird up there. There's another bird. And you're hearing that what seemed like silence wasn't really silence. There's still something there. It's just not the noise that you had in the car. And it's the same thing here. You know, your normal state of awareness is noise. When you experience for the first few times a mystical experience, it seems like complete silence, complete pure awareness. There's no self, there's nothing there. But as you become more used to the experience, you begin to realize there is something there because you're not alone. You are the conscious you, your pure awareness, but you're not existing independently. You are an extension of your higher self, your spiritual self. And that means that you can begin to look up and begin to connect to the individuality in your spiritual self. And that means that ideally, you could say, most people on earth, they're just acting and thinking and talking based on the outer self, the separate self. And ideally on the spiritual path, you disidentify that, you dissolve the separate self, and then you log into your real self, the real individuality that's in your higher self, and you begin to express that on earth. And if you understand that process, you can, first of all, you can never really believe that you have no self. You can never really believe that nothing is real. Because you experience your higher self is real. There's a spiritual realm that is real. And for that matter, even the world has a certain reality. It's not ultimately real in the sense that it's permanent and will never change, but you see that the world is an environment for your growth in consciousness. And your growth in consciousness is real. And therefore, what happens in the world and how you relate to it matters, because it either raises your consciousness or lowers your consciousness, expands your sense of self or narrows down your sense of self. So, you can never believe that nothing is real. Neither can you believe that there's no purpose to life, because you are experiencing. You're experiencing. Because I had these mystical experiences, I have let go of some of these separate selves that I used to think I was. And now I feel more free, I feel more at peace, and for that matter, you are suffering less. But there comes a point where I understand that in the beginning, the goal can seem to be to overcome suffering. But when you go a little higher on the path, become more familiar with the mystical experiences, suffering fades away. I mean, the goal is not to escape suffering. The goal is to be who you are, to be at peace, to engage with the world, to be creative, to bring forth something new, to have experiences. It's like, again, when you are still trapped in duality, you think that the only way to escape suffering is to not do anything in the world, not engage with the world, not make any decisions, not try to change anything. But when you go higher, you realize that the reason why doing something led to suffering was that you were doing through the separate self. And it's based on duality, but it's always the two opposite polarities, and this creates tension, that creates suffering. So tension is the product of the duality consciousness. It's not a product of the world, the differentiated world. The differentiated world is an environment that can facilitate your growth in awareness. And therefore, by engaging with the world, you can grow in awareness. And in fact, as I've said several times, in this age we're in, where we are transitioning from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius, we are meant to be spiritual by being engaged with the world. That's the highest form of spiritual growth, is to be engaged in the world instead of withdrawing from the world, as you saw many people do during Pisces. But there is still this consciousness, especially in Eastern philosophy, and therefore also in Neo-advaita and non-duality circles, that the only way to be spiritual or escape suffering is to disengage from the world. And that's just a misunderstanding, complete misunderstanding. As I said, it's flipping from one dualistic extreme, you're completely engaged with the world and identified with the world. To the opposite, you forsake the world. You denounce the world. And really another thing that comes into it is that what is it you're doing in the duality consciousness? This is again why it's so essential to understand duality. In the duality consciousness, you are using the separate self to define an ultimate reality. So you are saying, for example, the Christian religion is the only true religion, and it's the only way to be saved. And if you are a good Christian, you are guaranteed to be saved, and if not, you're going to suffer in hell for all eternity. That's one dualistic example of how you are seeking to define an ultimate reality. Or communism is the ultimate model for society. Scientific materialism is the ultimate way to know truth. Many of them. But what the non-dual teachers, the Neo-advaita teachers, are doing, they think they have liberated themselves from duality, but they have actually used the duality consciousness to define another ultimate reality, namely, there is no self, nothing is real, nothing matters. Now you see, it's important to realize that there are people who are suffering very intensely because of their separate selves. And therefore, hearing that the separate self is not real can be a liberation. It can be a step forward. But then if you add to it, there is no self and nothing is real, then there will come a point where all of a sudden now the boomerang comes back, the other dualistic polarity hits you in the neck, and you feel completely lost. Jessica Eve was asked to list some of the effects that she has seen many people experience as a result of following the Neo-advaita teachings. And here's just a short list of it. They couldn't be in relationships. They want to die, even considering suicide. It ruined their lives. They can't tell what's real and unreal. They move to more suffering, not less suffering. They feel that they would rather die as the only way to escape the madness in their minds. They feel apathy, dissociation from the world. They feel like their personality has been wiped out. There's a deadening of the mind. They're suffering by trying not to suffer. And life is meaningless, and a sense of nihilism. So these are just some of the effects. And, these are not good fruits to have on your resume as a spiritual teacher. So what I'm saying is that you can temporarily feel a relief by realizing that the separate self isn't real. But the only way to really be relieved is to look at these subconscious selves you have and dissolve them one by one. You can't do that all at once. You cannot just awaken and have an instant ego death. You can have an experience where you experience that the ego isn't real. That you can have. But you then need to use that to look at the elements of the ego, the illusions that the ego is based on, and dissolve them one by one. And if you don't do that, then your sense of being free of ego is just going to be temporary, because you're still going to be acting based on the subconscious selves you have. So I guess what I really wanted to get to here is you have your normal state of awareness, you have a mystical experience. And especially in the beginning, there's a great contrast. And you have to find a way to deal with it. So this means that as you begin the spiritual path, as you start having mystical experiences, you have a need to interpret the experience and put it in context so that you can still function in your life. Because most of us don't have the option to go into a monastery or a cave in the Himalayas and sit there for 12 years. And even doing so wouldn't necessarily help you overcome the ego, because nothing is pushing your buttons. So what I'm saying is, it's perfectly okay that we have to interpret the mystical experience. And therefore you can say, any spiritual teaching that talks about mystical experiences It's just a way to help people deal with the mystical experience and the contrast between everyday life and the mystical. And if a teaching helps people, it's okay. See, what the ego wants to do is to say a spiritual teaching should be the ultimate teaching, the highest possible teaching. It should be some ultimate truth. And that's what the Neo-advaitans and the non-dual teachers are saying. Non-self and nothing is real and there's really no purpose. You don't exist, there's no one here talking. This is the ultimate reality. But it isn't. It's just another illusion created from the duality consciousness. And the purpose of a mystical experience is to help you overcome these illusions, not reinforce them. But you can, if you interpret them a certain way, you can reinforce the illusion. So what I'm saying is you need to look at whatever spiritual teaching appeals to you. You need to look at it, and on their fruits you shall know them. Does it help me deal with my mystical experiences? Does it help me deal with everyday life? Does it help me integrate my mystical experiences and everyday life so that I really feel more at peace and I feel more myself, my higher self, and I dare to express that in the world? If you're just ending up being depressed and sitting in this little cave and not wanting to engage with the world and not want to do anything in life, there's something wrong with your interpretation of the mystical experience. And then I also wanted to say that I think that in the beginning, you need to interpret the mystical experience. But there can come a phase where you don't really need to interpret it anymore. Because you're realizing that you don't need to interpret it. Why do you need to interpret it when you are experiencing it? And that means that the previous interpretations that might have been helpful for you at a certain phase, they're meant to fade away. And if your outer mind insists on holding on to them and defending them and validating them, you're going to have problems. You're going to have tension. You're going to have a crisis at some point. And that's why it's essential to realize that there just comes a point where you have to let go of what helped you at a certain stage of a path. And that's again what's being sabotaged by these non-dual teachings is you have now reached the ultimate state of awakening. So there is nothing beyond this. There is nothing to let go of. But there is. As long as you're an embodiment on earth, there's going to be something to let go of. Because you still have elements of this self that makes it possible for you to integrate with a physical body on this dense planet. So I'm just saying, you always need to look beyond your present worldview and understanding. You need to keep questioning. You don't have to question it all at once because nobody can handle that. But you always need to, and that's why I found it myself very, very helpful to have this model that on planet Earth there are 144 possible levels of consciousness we can be on. And one way to explain this is that the lower we go in consciousness towards the lowest level, the more illusions we believe in, the more separate selves we have created that are pulling the conscious you into identifying yourself as however you see yourself, as a separate being basically, and trying to immortalize that separate being. But as you go higher on the path, and you go higher by shedding these illusions, so right now you're at a certain level. You don't need to shed all of the illusions between your level and the 144th level all at once. First of all, it can't be done. But even if you shed too many illusions, you will feel disoriented. So you just need to focus on the next illusion up. Then you go to the next level. Then you focus on the next illusion. And you just keep doing that. And there can come a point where you make peace with that. But in order to do that, you have to overcome this clearly dualistic reaction that many people go into of wanting some ultimate breakthrough. Wanting to reach the highest level of consciousness. The ultimate understanding. There is no ultimate understanding. Ultimately, in this world of form, you can reach the same level of consciousness as the Creator. But I can guarantee you that is way beyond what we can even imagine or envision here on earth. It's way beyond what nobody has ever been an embodiment on earth and reached the ultimate level of consciousness. I don't care what they say about spiritual teachers. It's just all an ego projection. There is no ultimate state of consciousness. Even beyond the crater, there are higher levels of consciousness. So it's like, this is the dualistic, again. You have, on one side, you're trying to, well, let's put it this way. The separate self is always trying to set itself up as having some ultimate status. And it can do this by creating a sense of self in the world. I am a powerful leader. I can make people follow me. I can create war, and I could destroy the whole planet if I wanted. So this is one way that the separate self seeks to reach some ultimate state. The other way that the separate self can seek to reach an ultimate state is say, oh, I am a spiritual teacher. I have reached an ultimate level of awareness. I see the ultimate truth, namely no self, nothing is real, or however the teaching is. And these are just two ways that the separate self is seeking to reach an ultimate status. And when you lock into where a mystical experience comes from, you realize there is no ultimate status. There's only ongoing self-transcendence. And so, how do you have a smooth transition when you start having mystical experiences? How do you have a smooth transition so that you don't lose your bearings, you don't lose your sense of identity, you don't go through this crisis of nihilism and no meaning and all this stuff? And I think the first thing you have to do really is to log into the idea of a path. And this is again what the Neo-advaitans and some non-dual teachers will deny. But you look back, and there's always been talk of a path. And it's just, again, the ego that wants to say, oh, there's a way to circumvent the path. I don't have to follow this long and arduous path. But you do, because you're shifting very gradually your sense of identity. So this is one thing, once you accept that it's a path. But you also accept there's a purpose for that path, which is, first of all, you become more peaceful, but also you become more creative. You can express yourself. And then I would say that you can also come to a point where you realize that you have a specific purpose for being alive on earth in this particular embodiment. That's what some of my breakthrough videos talk about. You have a life plan. And it is that before you come into this embodiment, you're meeting with your spiritual teachers in a higher realm, and you are planning this lifetime. And you are looking at two things. You're looking at, how can I have maximum growth in this lifetime? And that means really, what do I need to overcome in my psychology? So this is one aspect of your divine plan. The other aspect is, what kind of a gift can I bring to society, to this planet? How can I help move things forward? And you can do this if you have just compassion for other people who are suffering, and you want to help other people. But it's difficult to have that as long as you're suffering yourself. So you need to reach a certain level of the spiritual path where you have overcome these separate selves that cause you intense suffering before you can focus on helping others. But once you get to that point, you can focus on helping others. You can also, at some point, log into the fact that there is a spiritual realm beyond the material world. And there are self-aware beings in that realm. I call them ascended masters. Other spiritual traditions have called them other things. Doesn't really matter. But you can realize that the ascended masters have two functions. One is to help us grow individually, but another is to help raise the earth to a higher level where you overcome, for example, war, poverty, all the whatever problems you see on earth. So you can realize that the equation on earth is quite simple. The ascended masters have power to change any condition on earth, but they don't have the authority to do so because they are not in embodiment. You are in embodiment. You don't have the power to change poverty or war, but you have the authority. And you can give that authority to the ascended masters. You can work with the ascended masters so they can transform lower energies, they can bring forth new ideas and inventions, and you might be able to bring forth something that could move society a step forward. Again, in order to do that, you have to overcome this sense of wanting to do something ultimate. You want to just make your individual contribution, and when many people do this, then the world moves forward, as it has moved forward in the past several hundred years. And so this is another thing that can give you a sense of purpose. But the thing is, you can't really log into that sense of purpose from the separate self, as long as you're too identified with the separate self. And so let's just step back and look at that. Because when you are inside of these, inside the ego, these separate selves, the separate selves are focused on themselves. And the ego is kind of like a container that contains all the other selves. So the ego is totally focused on itself. So when you are identified with the ego, you are completely focused on yourself as a separate individual. And first of all, that creates suffering. But second of all, it also means that whatever you do, it doesn't really have the effect of improving the world. So you can actually look at the world and you can see that, for example, many Christians, they are involved in charitable work. And it's not that it doesn't help other people in some way, but they are doing it from a separate self. And so they are doing it ultimately, not really to selflessly help other people, but to gain some advantage for themselves. They think that God is going to think they're doing such good work, they're sure to go to heaven, or whatever they think. But I'm saying you can see spiritual people also who are engaging in some spiritual activity from the motivation of a separate self. But when you overcome that by looking at the separate self and dissolving them, you can start to, you are not doing things from the vantage point of a separate self. You're not doing it to accomplish something from a separate self. You are just being an open door for your higher self from the ascended masters to bring forth something. This is what Jesus said 2,000 years ago, I can of my own self do nothing. The Father within me, which is ultimately your higher self, doeth the work. And you can come to that point, and all of a sudden, you can still say, oh yeah, is the world ultimately real? No. But does that mean that nothing matters? No. Because what matters in this temporary world is the effect it has on our consciousness. And again, if you see yourself as a no-self and think that the self is unreal, then of course you will say, well, nothing matters. But when you see yourself that you are actually a real self, you are engaged in the process of expanding your sense of self, and this is ultimately real, and this has ultimate importance, then you can see that anything that helps you grow gives you a sense of purpose. It has meaning. It just doesn't have a meaning that can be fathomed by the separate self based on duality. Because in duality, you always have the value judgment. Oh, I'm a Christian and I'm doing charitable work, therefore I'm better than those non-Christians. God loves me more. So you can come to a point where you are engaging with the world. You can have a relationship, you can have a family, you can have a job, you can get an education, you can continually educate yourself and know more and more about the world and more about psychology and more about the spiritual side of life. And you can share that with other people. And your life has meaning, profound meaning. It doesn't have the same meaning it had when you were all identified with a separate self. But and it's true that being identified with a separate self, the separate self is interpreting this as having, everything as having meaning. This is what I talk about in one of my ego discourses about ego dramas, where I talk about these epic dramas that the separate self creates, that we are saving the world by making everyone Christians, for example. And so these kind of dramas, or this kind of motivation, it can motivate people, but it leads to suffering, and it doesn't really help raise the planet to a higher level. It just perpetuates the conflict. So once you escape that, you find that there is actually a higher sense of meaning. And so, again, you have people who have started to see the fallacy of the ego and this sense of meaning that the ego is imposing upon everything. It's all defined from itself. So there are people who started to see this, and this is genuine, and it can happen based on mystical experiences or even by you understanding it. But then some go from one dualistic extreme, the ego is the one who defines the ultimate meaning, to the other dualistic extreme saying there is no meaning. Nothing matters. Again, you're flipping from one dualistic extreme to the other. And the middle way, the true path, is to transcend both dualistic extremes. And the key to that is mystical experiences. But the key to transcending the dualistic extremes is to realize that whatever dualistic selves you have left will color your interpretation of the mystical experience. And therefore, your interpretation, whatever you use, whether it's Neo-advaita, non-duality, Christianity, this or that, whatever you use to interpret your mystical experiences is just a temporary thing, and you need to continually revise it and look for a higher and higher way to interpret that mystical experience until you come to a point where you don't need to interpret it anymore.